Roll it down. Free yourself, girl. You got class and you got pride. Come together, cause we're stronger, unified.
Okay, so you just heard our keynote presentation from Keithlyn Carew, founder of Helen's Daughters. So many things to unpack, but that's not my role here because we have a power-packed panel discussion that's coming right up. And speaking about power-packed, excuse me, the moderator of this segment that I can also stand behind is all about harnessing that power and sharing power as it relates to females in this space and carrying on this work. And it is my pleasure to introduce her for this evening as she guides us through another important segment. Of course, you might be noticing me turning my head to my second screen. So if you're wondering what she's looking at, it's my second screen over here as I navigate with you all. Now, as mentioned before, here is the introduction for our moderator for this evening. Aisha Constable is a climate researcher and practitioner who applies a feminist approach to her work as a scholar activist. She has researched and published on gender and climate change as part of her doctoral studies, which links her interest in agriculture, climate adaptation, youth, and gender. Aisha is the founder of Girls Care and the Young People for Action on Climate Change Jamaica. She is the co-lead of the Caribbean movement-led approach for climate justice and feminists, organizing under the auspices of the Global Fund for Women, and was recently appointed to the board of directors for the International Institute of Sustainable Development. Everyone, please join me in sharing your emojis, your hands, any icons to welcoming our moderator for this session, Aisha Constable. Aisha, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Dana Lynn, the hostess with the mostess. It is such a pleasure to be a part of the conversation, to be a part of this conference on this side. And I would be remiss to not shout out and congratulate Derval, Christine, and the team for pulling off such an amazing initiative once again. You all, to me, are the epitome of consistency and, stick-to-itiveness in all its forms, and you continue to exceed expectations year after year, and I applaud you, and I'm happy to be affiliated with you in the ways that I am. We have an amazing panel this evening, distilling the question of climate-sensitive leadership, with a play on the word leadership and Caribbean resilience. We have with us Honorable Dr. Joel Clark. We have Indu Sharma. We have Immaculata Casimiro, or Maki, as we call her affectionately. We have Vidya Kisoon from Guyana, and we have Rana Haynes. I'm sure these are names you're familiar with. At least some of them, and work, they do work which you might be familiar with as well. And so today we get to hear a little bit more from them as it relates specifically to that question of gender sensitive leadership for climate resilience. We are going to, you're going to be able to see the detailed bios of our panelists in the chat, but we're going to start our conversation this evening by asking each of them to answer that question, big ticket question, of what is climate sensitive leadership, or what does that mean to you? And I want you to also integrate that into the answer around who are you? What is your story? And what does climate sensitive leadership mean to you? So you'll be able to give us a little bit of intro information, maybe not exactly what is in the bio, since we have that in the chat, but some other things that we wouldn't necessarily know about who you are, how you got here, and why this topic of climate sensitive leadership and Caribbean climate resilience is so integral to your work and who you are. I'm going to start, and not putting my friend and co-lead Dr. Clark on the spot, but her name is at the top of the list. I see her shaking her head, but blame Derval and Christine for sending the list in this order. But I'll give each of you 2 to 3 minutes to answer that question of what does climate sensitive leadership mean to you? And please also answer the question of who you are and a little bit about the work that you do. You are
Thank you so much, Aisha. And I feel so honored to be part of this panel and to be even invited to speak. But I cannot start, unfortunately, without giving a really big shout out to Ms. Haynes. This comes from a colleague of yours from St. Kitts. So we're a small country. I think it's Lawyer Freeman. He said, say hi and tell you he's a feminist too. No, Aisha, thank you for the question. And I'll be very brief because I know it's what it means to us, and it's gender sensitive and climate sensitive leadership. And for me, it's really acknowledging the gaps between policy and delivery of services. And for me, as a politician, an advocate, a consultant, and a climate activist, it's always recognizing that there are gaps that we need to fill, and it's gaps in service delivery to the most vulnerable. It's also recognizing the need for justice and inclusivity and diversity when we're developing policy for protecting the most vulnerable. It's being intentional about women's role in transforming society and also in women's role in responding to the climate crisis, because women are not just the most vulnerable, but they can also be the key actors of change and transformation. It's also accepting that women in politics must lead, and women in leadership must lead to more inclusive language, use of a feminist perspective and a gendered lens in providing solutions to people who need it most. And as our keynote speaker said, intersectional approach to leadership. Climate sensitivity and gender sensitivity and women in politics and feminist leadership perspective means you appreciate the intersectional realities of women, and you appreciate the need to craft policies around servicing those who need it most. I'll stop there. And that was like 1 minute, 50 seconds. Thank you.
So we have to give you back your 1 minute, 30 seconds for the next question. Thank you so much. You said a lot of very clear and integral, at least in terms of references that were made, gender lens, feminist approaches, language, inclusivity. And I'm sure we'll hear some of that repeated in the responses to come. But just to be fair, I'm going to look back at my list. And yes, Ms. Sharma, Indi Sharma, please, a little bit about your background and also what does gender sensitive leadership mean to you?
Thank you so much, Aisha. And I really want to echo the sentiments of the other speakers in congratulating Duval and her team, Christine and the other members of the team in putting this on. I attended last year's conference, and I was so impressed that there are so many like-minded women in the Caribbean really doing the work and advocating for change in relation to climate change, as well as giving voice to those women and who are not as well represented as they could be. So what does it all mean for me? I've had a long career in corporate life, and now I'm a consultant, and I specifically focus on women's issues, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as supporting SMEs. And that actually, we talk about intersectionality, that speaks to women as well, because many of our SMEs and our nano enterprises here in Trinidad are founded and operated by women. And in my view, a woman's place is wherever decisions are being made, whether that be in whatever sphere of life. We have decision making in our homes, in our communities, in our workplaces, but also in places where, and Joelle referenced it, where policy decisions are being made as well. For me, it means leading by example and exercising that equitable agenda in very meaningful ways in whatever sphere of influence you are. I think we have a lot to do in the Caribbean yet. But at the same time, we have come a little way along the road. I saw recently that the Cabinet of New Zealand has become 50-50 gender parity. just this month. And I think that is a signpost for us in the Caribbean as well, because I think we we take it for granted that our leaders are going to take care of us, but we don't advocate on our own behalf many times. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity, especially through these fora, like this climate conscious fora, to really make our voices heard and make sure that we get not only policy change, but also budgetary allocation in our national budgets, which gives actual meaning and implementation, the opportunity for implementation of measures that are going to impact us in a positive way. So with that, I would just, and I'll talk a little bit more about my work as we go along.
Yes, we would certainly look forward to hearing that. And as you made reference to the Parliament of New Zealand and the 50-50 breakdown, I'm reminded of a statement that, gender activists and feminists often make, which is that gender equity is not a numbers game. And so it'll be interesting to see what that means for equality, beyond the figures. To further contextualize our conversation, and before I turn to Mackie, I'm going to read a little bit of the blurb of sorts that introduces the concept for this conversation. Women belong in all places where decisions are made, especially when it relates directly to their lives and livelihoods. Despite being at the forefront of the climate justice movement, women and girls are often left out of decision-making. Statistically, 80% of people affected by the climate crisis are women. Women and girls are impacted by climate disasters based on their differential social roles, responsibilities, decision-making, and access to resources. Historically, women faced greater barriers than men in advancing to positions of power. This results in underrepresentation of women in decision-making and undermines gender equality. And I think that goes back to references that were made by both Joyelle and Indu in their opening statements. At this point, I'm going to invite Mackie to share with us her thoughts, which I'm particularly excited to hear, as excited to hear you as well, Joyelle and Indu. But Mackie comes to us from an indigenous community in Guyana. And so I'm keen on hearing again, a little bit about your background, but more importantly, Mackie, what does gender sensitive leadership mean to your community?
I'm joining you from very small and far away. I sit here under the skies, and thankfully I can access the internet. So I am joining you here today from Paterno Village space, and I am Immaculata Council, and I also coordinate the Wapichan Women's Movement activities and the different programs that we have here. So I work closely with women's group across 21 communities, and I do a lot of work on awareness raising, educating women on their I am more like at the grassroots level, and I have grounded information from communities. I cannot speak more when you talk about leadership like at a wider Caribbean, but I can say more like in Guyana. And when we speak about leadership, even at the national level in Guyana, there is still a big gap under representation. Male figures dominate the field, especially in politics and elections. And likewise, it's almost the same for our communities here, where there's more male dominance as the elected chiefs. Of what we see happening is that through the work of the Wapichan Women's Movement, we have been supporting women across the South community in order to try and fill this gap that we have seen. So now, from the last elections, we have seen 65 women being on the village leadership, while there are still 105 men as tushals and counselors. So it was very interesting at the last village council elections, and for the first time we had 12 women who actually contested those elections. They didn't win the elections, but 5 of them became deputy tushals. And as I said, we have 65 women now leading and being part of that village governance in the 21 communities. So the work, thinking when you look at it from a gender perspective, indeed, we need to have in the communities that we work with, because women play a very important role. We need to be involved in decision making, especially as it relates, to the different affairs of the communities that we have here. If you have all seen, I'm sure you would read Guyana's news, that you have seen a lot of debate around sale of carbon credits in Guyana. So all of that we have issues with as well as a community, as communities, as women, and we need to be involved. We must be involved when it comes to these different decisions that are being made, especially at the national level, that can have impacts on our lives. At present, I can sadly say that we have food insecurity, especially when it comes to our main staple like farine and cassava we use on a daily basis. And so this very forum is very important. I know that where we can share together as Caribbean people, that you can learn what is happening as well in our communities. And likewise, I am learning from all of you here as well. So again, I think one of the things when we look at gender sensitive leadership, it calls for a lot of supporting from each other. We're here in Guyana. We want to see as well support from other Caribbean countries to support the struggles that we have as Indigenous people in Guyana as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maki. A very, very comprehensive response. And I certainly would love to come back to that question. You emphasized the need for women's involvement in all of the conversations and decisions around climate action and governance. And I'd love to hear you speak to why we need women's involvement, just to articulate that for us. And also, as you spoke, I'm reminded of the nuanced context in which we operate in the Caribbean as it pertains to gender. Very often we have an assumption of what the gender dimensions of the issues are in all the communities across the Caribbean, and they do not look the same. And also the importance of centering and explicitly speaking to the needs of Indigenous communities in this conversation. Thank you. I'm going to read another section of this blurb before I turn over to Sir Vidya. It says here, despite their vulnerability, women and girls should not only be seen as victims of climate change, but as active and effective agents and promoters of solutions. The inclusion of women in leadership will lead to more diverse problem solving and would lead to more effective resilient strategies that support inclusion and justice for all people. And Mr. Kisun, Sir Vidya, your background in gender-based violence, I believe, places you in a very, very niche position in this conversation to possibly link that to the climate justice debate. So of course, we're asking you to share a little bit more about yourself in the context of that work, and also to answer the question of what does gender sensitive leadership mean to you?
So good evening, everyone. I had prepared notes to use, but I cannot use the notes because it would have been different time. Thank you. I join with all of the other speakers to thank the organizers, Deval, Christine, and everyone, for organizing this and to invite me to participate as a panelist. I am very grateful for last year's conference because it was the first time that I had participated in any discussion in which gender justice and climate justice were intersected. and I learned a lot. And I think I come to this from a perspective of dealing with gender-based violence and recognizing, and I'm grateful to Christine Sanwaru, who helped to bridge only in 2021 or so, helped me to understand that there's a connection between gender-based violence and what we do to the earth and the environment. I would like to thank Christy, who last night talked about the Bali principles of justice, the climate justice. I never heard of those before, but I looked at it today, and it's in this spirit of learning. I recognize that in the Bali, there's a concept of Mother Earth, and we're not going to use Mother Earth at the UN. In the UN, they're going to use, as Caitlin said, sometimes it's a different language. And I will share a link later on in the chat of something I wrote at the end of 2021, trying to connect protecting the earth, dealing with gender-based violence, and my Hindu faith. And I'll put that in the chat. And I'm very grateful to Charlene and Najir, who earlier this year had another discussion about LGBTI equality and protecting the environment. And again, I wrote something else because linking these are important, because I have done work in LGBTI equality. We're doing work on gender justice. Within the LGBTI space, for example, I met many men who were not necessarily feminists, nor were they interested in gender equality, because for many people, it was to participate in patriarchy and all of the privilege that patriarchy had to use. And that is why I think the first thing for us to understand LeadHership, gender-sensitive LeadHership, is that we need to understand what do we mean by being gender-sensitive, and is being gender-sensitive enough, right? Because last year, I'm so grateful that I heard Dr. Clark talk today about intersectionality and so on. Because last year, one of our prominent women politicians, Guyana has a quota system of 1/3 women on the list. But we have found that that does not necessarily mean, because the women have to do what the men in the political parties tell them to do. And that is just how, and our political parties are patriarchal and awful. So what the woman said to me that, Vidya, I am not a feminist. She's not a feminist. And I was shocked, because I know that this woman had access to gender training as part of her studies. So she would understand, but she had to be participating in political discussions about gender equality in the country. And this is the kind of framework that, as a man, nervously as I sit, because I'm never sure, I realize that everyone says not every woman is a feminist. But then what do I do as a middle-class man of Indian origins in a very, cisgender, to say to hold women and other leaders accountable when they do not deliver according to the principles they should. So even if they do not subscribe to things which have not been written, but even in the human rights language. And so the first thing for me is that however we frame the solution for LeadHership, is that for gender-sensitive LeadHership, is that we have to think about how do we communicate our expectations of those leaders? How do we prepare people to be gender-sensitive leaders, right? And then how do we, hold them accountable? And how do we have conversations in our community about recognizing this? I believe that I just want to share from person, because I come to this, as I said, from the gender, from gender, not from environment. That one of the impressions I've had, which I've shared with colleagues in Guyana, is that anytime I think of the environmental movement, it is very feminine. It's very woman-led. It has always been since 1995, around the time when I got involved in gender-based violence work. And I wonder sometimes if there isn't a feminization of this climate justice work, because it is considered caring work. And we do not have a value for caring work. And we think that it is, women do caring work. So while men might be farmers and fishers and so on, they do that in a way which is exploiting. While, as Keithlyn talked about her grandmother diversifying and paying attention to where the next meal will come from, it then brings a different perspective. And I had a trigger warning about, I just want to hold space for a young woman who died. And I just put this trigger warning. In October 2008, a young environmental officer, Alicia Foster, a man shot and killed her outside her home. And the society believes that it was related to her work as an environmental protection officer and nothing else. And no one has ever been found for her work. And to me, when we think about how we are violent towards and how patriarchy is violent towards the environment and violent towards the earth and how we contextually, how we talk about gender-based violence, I remember that man thinking that he could do this to her and in front of her parents' home and in front of her 11-year-old sister. So this gender-sensitive leadership brings in to me this understanding. There's another level to which I believe, which I've learned as well, and which I'm now understanding, is that when we talk about connection, that many of us, we talk about breaking borders, we're not islands, and none of us are islands. But I think as we talk about our connection to living things, is that we talk about our connection to the environment. And to understand that getting back this connection to our environment, to understand that the land does not belong to us, but we belong to the land, and it is very different. I wanted to start my statement by a land acknowledgement, and I'm grateful to be here with Maki. And I'm conscious of the difference. Maki is in deep South Rupununi under the night sky. That black you see there is the night sky in the Rupununi. Here I am in Georgetown with electricity and internet. And this is the dilemma, and this is the problem of how we deal with this, that I am a beneficiary of the privilege of colonialism in a way, while Maki and her peoples continue not to have the same privilege. And this, to me, is part of the work that we have to do. And that as we do this intersectional leadership, and we think about these things, there's so many thoughts to think about. So I will stop there now. I hope I was slow enough. No, I'm grateful. No snails and no time checks. Thank you very much again for having me here, and I look forward to continuing to learn from you all.
Thank you so much, Vidya. As I looked on the other panelists' faces as you spoke, I recognized that they were willing to allow you to take up the next 30 minutes of this conversation. Everybody was very much engrossed, and it was a riveting intervention by you. So many rich insights. You mentioned M. Christie's presentation yesterday and your takeaway, and I think it's a very timely and important reminder of the value of curating these spaces. Just the mere fact that in one session yesterday, you were able to learn, something one very tangible takeaway, and that adds to what you do or adds value to the work that you're now able to do. So again, shout out to the team. And also, as you spoke about gender-based violence and connecting it to climate justice, I think we could potentially organize a whole other conference around that. You pose some very big questions that we probably need to, distill in a separate conference. But thank you, very, very rich and very, very enlightening insights you shared. I'm going to invite Ruana, and Ruana brings a wealth of experience from legal background, speaking background with her TEDx experience, bridging the gap between national and global governance and climate action, research possibly with her affiliation with climate analytics. And so I'm very happy to invite you, Ruana, at this point to maybe share with us a little bit more about your background and also to answer for us, what does climate sensitive leadership mean?
Thank you so much, Aisha, and hello, everyone. I really can't begin my remarks without congratulating Duval and the team for this excellent conference. I had the privilege to also participate last year, and I had the privilege to participate last year, and I did leave my panel being very moved and having learned so very much from the other panelists and from the discussions that occurred. So congratulations on continuing this really fantastic initiative. It is a conversation that is long overdue. So a little bit about me, and hello, Dr. Clark. Thank you for bringing greetings. I am first and foremost a Caribbean woman, and I have spent quite a bit of time also with your colleagues from St. Kitts and Nevis. The privilege and honor is all mine. So a little bit about my work and my background. I think unlike many of the other panelists, my early career in climate change was really focused at the international level. So I entered the climate change discussion and the climate change space. So I did enter the climate change discussion at the international level as a young African descended woman in what is primarily a white male space. And so, that experience has shaped my views and perspectives a lot over the years since I've been involved in the climate change process. At the international level, this discussion around the intersectionality of the climate crisis, around climate justice, around the need to center the voices and experiences and solutions of the vulnerable is still a very nascent one. And what that means is I have the impression that at the international level, there is so much that still has to be learned from what is actually taking place within countries and within regions, especially within countries like ours. In the international context, the discussions tend to focus on the solutions that have been promoted as the way forward, through the traditional scientific channels, which, although they have made great advancements over the years, generally reflect a view that is driven by the research of the global north, that also tends to be, very, very centered on, I guess, approaches that men would take to solving a crisis and not necessarily taking on board what we refer to now as more traditional knowledge approaches, not taking on board approaches that are developed, at the grassroots level. This situation is beginning to change. And so although my work would have started exclusively in the international context as a representative of my country and my region, and also small island developing states across the world, I have now shifted my focus also to include work at the regional and national levels, because precisely of that gap between the conversation that takes place at the international level, where power is the most important currency in many instances, and what we see as needed coming from the regional and the national levels. I would say that the diversification of the climate discussion has been an extraordinarily welcome, it has been an extraordinarily welcome thing. A lot of change has happened since 2020, since we had the situation with George Floyd, since we had the protests that were launched as a result of that, which brought so much energy and momentum to this discussion of intersectionality, this discussion about the ways in which a capitalist system has inflicted and continues to inflict violence on the most vulnerable, and including nature itself as a recipient of that violence. And so even though, as I started off, the discussion of these issues is still very nascent at the international level, the glass ceiling is beginning to fracture. I want to leave with you some reflections that have come out of the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as it relates to this issue of taking a gender lens to the climate crisis. So in the latest report from the IPCC, which was issued a few weeks ago, there are exactly only in the synthesis 4 mentions of gender in that document. The first relates to the impact that climate change is going to have and is having on gender. And I think we've heard a bit about this from the other distinguished speakers, including from Keithlin in Vidya's presentation as well, thinking about, the disproportionate impacts that will occur as a result of drought, as a result of sea level rise, as a result of, the impacts that we have in the agricultural sector in particular on women, right? That where climate change is the root. So that's where it starts. But then it goes into areas that, from my perspective, are far more interesting and contribute a lot to this discussion about what leadership means in the context of climate justice. So the second mention speaks specifically to the trade-offs between climate action and sustainable development and achieving sustainable development. At the international level, we are still caught up in trying to counteract this narrative that environmental action or action in support of the environment, policymaking in support of the environment, undermines development goals. So we had a whole conference 30 plus years ago in Rio to talk about sustainable development, to link these notions of protection of the environment that sustains us and our pursuit of development, and to change this notion of what development means, where it does not necessarily have to be based on this extractive, violent model that we currently have. And yet we are still caught up in that struggle of trying to counteract that narrative. So the IPCC report goes as far as to say that there will be trade-offs between climate action and the attainment of sustainable development. But if we are to give adequate attention to, and they list some things, capacity building, finance, governance, technology transfer, investments, and context-specific gender-based and other social equity considerations, that these will go a very long way in mitigating those trade-offs. So we see here that a gender-responsive and equity-based or a justice-based approach to climate action is being promoted as a means of counteracting this narrative and mitigating perceived trade-offs between the protection of the environment and the pursuit of development, even sustainable development.
Thank you so much, Ruana. I'm going to ask you to just pause there for now, because we have as a situation. Has Mackie already? So Mackie's battery life was running quite low and we wanted to have her come back into the conversation. But seemingly she has dropped off the call. Derval or Christine, if you could just confirm.
I can still hear you.
Oh, Mackie. Oh, hi, Mackie. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to turn, I know we're pressed for time, but Derval, Christine, I guarantee you, no one is leaving the call. It's a very intriguing conversation. People are going to stay. But again, a reminder that we keep our responses as tight as possible so that we give the other panelists, you know, fair time to come in as well. And maybe in the next round of questions, you get a chance to maybe mention some of the other things that you would have at this point. I am going to ask you, Mackie, if you can. And interestingly enough, the question I had for you is the same question I said I would have asked based on what you said initially about how you achieve or how you seek to achieve gender sensitive leadership in the work that you're doing in your community and why it is important in the context of building climate resilience in the work around climate justice.
Okay. In the work that we do as women, we know the issues that women face and the challenges that they have. We are able to have trainings, and one of those trainings that we're talking about climate justice. We're talking about their rights, knowing that they need to be involved when it comes to whatever activities that are in our communities. And of recent, when you look at what is happening in Guyana's situation, we have designed a program where we are going to reach out into communities to talk and speak about the carbon credits and the markets and how it can have impacts on our lives as Indigenous people, because we have been standing to defend the forest, and that we're contributing in our own way to the mitigation of climate change by. And so our women in our communities understand that we have been our communities are rich in, I would say, as having carbon sinks that are available here. We have been protecting the environment, and we continue through the work that we're doing, you know, to defend the land, forest that we as Indigenous people depend on. We know that other people, their way of life is not like us. We have a total different way of life to others because we depend on the environment for fishing, for hunting, and for farming. So this is something that when we reach to communities, we have these conversations with women. You know, you can listen to them, you can know what are some of their challenges. And of recent, we have a strategic plan for the Work with Genuine Women's Movement, where we're going to look to see how we can support women livelihood projects through the work that we have been doing, because of the food that they usually have. So we want to work towards having livelihood opportunities available, so women can tap into these different opportunities. They can become climate resilient. You know, they can have food, they can store it for future use, and so on. So that is what we have been doing for now, yes, and for in the future as well.
Thank you so much, Mackie. I think it was Vidya who spoke to the feminization of climate activism and linking it to the care economy, you know, work that is seemingly undervalued, always underpaid. And also as you speak, I'm reminded of the fact that climate resilience looks different across the communities, right? So for your community, it's food, it's meeting those basic needs. In other spaces, we talk about climate resilience, and it's the big things, it's solar panels and technology and renewable technology systems. So again, you know, it's so important to understand what it means for the different communities and groups that we try to speak for and speak on behalf of in our different spaces. I'm going to ask the same question, but I'm going to ask Indu to give one example, one very concrete example of how you seek to promote gender sensitive leadership in your work as someone in the private sector, for example, what does that look like? One example.
Okay, so I mean, we are very much focused in Trinidad on promoting environmental and social governance among our corporate clients and among the business community. And that involves taking into account environmental and social factors in terms of in establishing in your business whether you have a positive impact or a negative impact on the environment, and a positive impact or a negative impact to people and communities. And we're very focused in that regard. It's not an easy journey in Trinidad and Tobago because we are set in a certain paradigm in terms of how our economy functions. But there is a really good groundswell of awareness, and we're really promoting that, trying to capitalize on that. And really what it involves is somewhat changing our view of business models, not relying on business in terms or perceiving business in terms of profit and loss only, but taking into account environmental and social factors and measuring impacts and looking also at reporting on those impacts very transparently, and really taking the corporate world from a lot of headline greenwashing, as you want to, if you want to call it that, to something really much more meaningful. And in some cases, I mean, based on our energy economy, the whole paradigm needs to shift, the whole paradigm needs to change, because at the end of the day, we need to reinvent, we need to look at circular economy and sustainable approaches to doing business. So it's a long journey. I don't pretend that we have reached anywhere near where we need to be, but at the same time, we're starting the conversation and we're encouraging all different kinds of businesses to look at strategy and risk through the ESG lens, because we want to encourage people to exist in business for the long term. And ESG and sustainable business is really for the long term, not just for profit and for the short term. So that's one of the things that we are actively promoting in Trinidad and Tobago. I would say also, if I could just mention, you know, the whole question of ESG frameworks allows us to be more collaborative between the public sector, the private sector, and NGOs, and that enables a different kind of conversation to happen, to take into account the huge impact that NGOs have, huge positive impact that NGOs have in our economy, is something that we are advocating for as well.
Thank you so much, Indo. Very, very concrete example and something that we can possibly replicate and borrow to use in different contexts across the region. And as you mentioned, ESG, there's so many conversations happening around ESG and climate finance, for example, you know, and broadening that framework, and also the question of business models. And you know, creating a shift around that, and Ruana would have spoken to development models and also shifting paradigms where that's concerned. So we see the synergies. Right now, I'm going to ask the same question of Mr. Vidya. One concrete example of how you are promoting gender-sensitive leadership in the work that you do to promote climate resilience. And I'm trying to rush you a little bit because there's one other round of questions that I'd love for us to be able to get to. So if you can give us one example, that'd be great.
So, Aisha, so I want to do, first of all, I just want to do something to acknowledge Danuta's presence in this, Danuta Radzik's presence in this call. Danuta is one of my guides and has been is in the forefront of the work going on against what's happening with oil and gas in Guyana. And Danuta has asked a very interesting question in the chat, which I know we've had this discussion, I've heard on this discussion, but it's a very contentious one. Like, how do we view the leadership of women leaders like Prime Minister Mia Mottley, who on the one hand is advocating for climate, you know, for certain things, but on the other hand is pushing exploitative industries. And that is, Danuta is very, you know, has reminded us. I just want to bring that in. Aisha, I wish I could say that I had any concrete examples, because what the conversation I had with that with the woman political leader last year hit home for me how much the work that we've been trying to do to talk about gender, to talk about intersectionality, to understand all of the complicated, all of the different issues has failed. Because this is a woman who's younger than me, who went to the University of Guyana, who would have done gender training, which I thought is updated, and can still stand and say, I'm not a feminist, Vidya, and see that because she thinks that something is wrong with feminism and to be labeled as such. And so therefore, anything in my head, it's not so much the concrete, it's that I think we really need to do a kind of stock check. And this is perhaps something, a kind of like a check. What are we really doing? Previously, we thought it was a numbers game, that we had to have women present at the table. Indu mentioned something interesting about greenwashing. There's something awful happening in Ghana about how greenwashing is being done by ExxonMobil. Whenever ExxonMobil is talking about the work that's going on in the environment, it's usually young women. And I know at least one of the young women, brilliant young woman who's doing some environmental work. And they then put, other young women to sort of be the face to say that ExxonMobil is supporting, whatever environmental work or so on. And again, it's all of these things that are coming, and you have this consciousness, but sometimes people aren't seeing it. They're very subtle. So there's very subtle messaging that is happening. And we're doing this in an environment in which men especially are pushing the oil and gas industries. Danuta mentioned people are now being attacked. The president, a woman who's president of the Ghana Press Association, has come in for trolling on the internet because she just simply is asking, the journalists are asking questions, as part of the accountability and governance. So I think for what all I've been doing with colleagues, and I can say this in Ghana, I know that this is what we're trying to do in the region, and I'm glad, there's some other persons, is that we have to keep talking like this about, and to educate those who are in the environment who might not be conscious of the gender issues about what's happening. And for those of us who have been working on gender equality and thinking about gender-based violence as only things like domestic violence, but not thinking about structural violence. And I'm glad Nicole Hendrickson's given reference to a paper, that we have to think deeper about the systemic gender-based violence and to keep talking, researching, and advocating around that so that we can really intersect these, and also to bring up the case study, because that's the only thing I can see. Because what we see in Ghana is, I think in the world, sorry, Aisha, yeah. I think there's been a reversal in terms of progress being made when you think about the abortion issues and so in the US and all of that. But just to say that there's a lot of work that, we seem to have to catch up on, right? Thanks.
Thank you so much again, Vidya. And again, I was very happy to hear you go on and even mention abortion rights. It's very rare that you hear any man in the Caribbean space speak to that as an area of importance, an issue of importance. So definitely a feminist ally in Vidya. I know I see your hand, Indu, but I'm gonna throw the question to Ruana and then to Mr. Clark before I come back to you, please. So Ruana, that question of integrating measures for climate sensitive leadership in your work, especially in the context of this, high level political global realm in which you operate. What does that look like? One example, if you can.
In my international work, what it looks like is radical authenticity, and on my part, and being very unapologetic about who I am and what I represent in any given room. I've had experiences where it was very, very clear to me that absolutely no one was interested in anything I had to say because of who I represent and because of who I am. It was taken for granted that I couldn't possibly know what I was speaking about. And I can say that that has since changed over the years. And I think part of that change has come about as a result of my own hard work, but also the certainty that I had that the perspective that I represented was valuable, and that the point of view that I brought to the table was one that would be able to advance the discussion. So that would be my example, and I'll be short this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. No, thank you so much, not for being short, but for the very concrete examples, and also for mentioning radical authenticity. So important, especially for Afro-Caribbean women in those spaces. There's a whole nother conference happening in the chat, and I wish we had the time to go through each comment intervention there, but we don't, sadly. So I'm inviting participants to take the time and just go through some of these comments. Very rich insights in the chat as well. Minister Clark, one way in which through your work at this very high level, you are promoting gender-sensitive leadership for Caribbean climate resilience.
Thank you very much for that question. And coming in last, it's so easy because everything that has been said is so relevant. I think it's important, however, as a woman in politics and as a feminist politician, to establish that there is women in politics, there is the issue of women as political leaders, and then there is also the issue of feminists as leaders in the Caribbean space, and feminists as leaders who are representing issues that affect CIDs, Caribbean CIDs in particular. So I just needed to say that. And the one thing that I've done is always find a way to link the feminist lens, the gender perspective, and political leadership and advocacy. We oftentimes think of the political space as you make laws, you do this, but it's non-consultative, it's not inclusive, it does not allow for a gendered lens and a gendered perspective or a gendered analysis of how legislation and leadership and policy affect the most vulnerable. And I've made it very clear in this space to always include that as a framework in which you determine how policies and legislation is developed. So that's my take on that one thing.
And I know you could go on. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Indu at this point. Indu had a question, and I think that the points you raised, Joelle, underscore all the other things that persons here pointed out that their work surrounds in terms of climate gender-sensitive leadership, because we know that policy-making, legislative piece is very important to create the enabling framework to do much of the other things that we want to do. So Indu, you had a question, but also the next question I had for you was around the support that the private sector can provide to promote climate sensitive, gender sensitive rather, leadership for resilience building in the Caribbean.
Yeah, so thank you. And I think we're all sort of touching on similar topics. I think it was more of a comment than a question. It was really around having that framework. And I think Joelle touched on it. In my corporate life, I mean, when we're talking about equity and inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is a really conscious and active methodology that you have to apply in your everyday life, unpacking your unconscious biases. And I'm using corporate language, but I hope it resonates somehow, because we all have our unconscious biases, and we need to take note of those things and understand why we may be thinking in a particular way. We want to make sure that we have diverse opinions wherever in our spheres of influence. And it has to be very conscious. The issue of allyship as well is really important to advocating and advancing the women's agenda, particularly in the private sector. And I mean, the private sector is like politics, is dominated by men. And I think Vidya also mentioned, it's not enough to have a seat at the table. It's to have allies in men who help women along in their careers, but also make sure that the resources and policies are there to back up the needs of individuals, not necessarily as a group. We don't need to treat each other as a group. We treat each other as individuals. I also just wanted to comment as well that mainstreaming, and it's not a bad word in my world necessarily, but mainstreaming the activist conversation and raising it at board levels and in corporate life and in as a consultant with the clients that I have is an important activity that we pursue as consultants and people who operate in the business world. Because at the end of the day, 30 years ago when I started out in life, the whole question of environmental activism was seen to be so much of almost a terrorist threat for the corporate world. We've come a long way from there, but we have to keep that conversation going and make people understand from there, because they may have their own views, make people understand that this is a conversation that's not going to go away, because it does impact long-term growth and long-term sustainability of not only our companies, but also our economies as well.
And that's the truth of it, having always to be able to convince private sector of what the impact is on their bottom line.
On the bottom line.
And
That's the language they understand.
unfortunately, that's the truth of it. Ruana is big up to you, Ruana. Ruana is giving some very fulsome responses to the questions in the chat. Like, I don't know if you're copy and pasting them out your brain, but it's some detailed responses. So I encourage you all to run over to the chat to look at some of these responses. I'm going to turn over to you, Vidya. A question that we have here about how men can better support the empowerment and equality efforts for women. I know you said earlier you have no concrete examples of how you do this, but I know that this is all you do. You just don't see it in that piecemeal way. This is what you do. So we want to hear from you. How can other men support this work around empowerment of women and the push for equality? And we're looking for shorter responses this time as well, Vidya.
I know, this is the problem. This is probably why it's easy for me to just type anything in the chat. But I just, first of all, I am grateful to Dr. Janice Jackson, who is another one of my mentors, who reminded me that no one can empower anyone. You only empower yourself. And this is an important context. So what I have learned is that it's for men to listen to women. And I like to remember my father reading some stories, reading Maticore, which was published in Trinidad, which is a collection of Indian women's stories. And, he just happened to pick up the book. And I think for him, he had never listened to women talking about the things. And in that book, Maticore, for those of you who don't know, is a Hindu wedding ritual. It's on the Friday night before the wedding. So I think for any man who wants to, you have to listen to women and women all around, whatever that is. And that means reading the stories. It also means challenging and unlearning every single thing you know about what it is to be a man. And to realize that, Tej Kumar Motilal was on the chat. Tej had reminded us that transformation can be painful because, you have to let go of what you are to become something new. And that could be painful. And for a lot of us men who have to understand that. But the process is good because one of the privileges that I've had is to be nurtured in a community. So it was never painful for me because of the community here, of the names I've called, and now with other persons, that there's no, I've not lost anything in learning more and engaging more, and there are new issues. So I think for men, for us as men, it's to unlearn. And there's a lot of pressure on us to be a particular way. And it's to recognize that and resist that because, again, capitalism wants a particular kind of man, and so there's work and learning and engaging. And for those of us who are persons of faith, is really to question our faith. As a Hindu, I've been questioning where patriarchy exists and how, the worship of the female divine doesn't necessarily mean anything about gender equality or anything like that. And to start to open up that kind of, to challenge other men to think about it. And that's something that we have to keep doing. And for any man working on gender equality in our Caribbean, stop drinking alcohol and supporting the alcohol industry. That's one of the things I have to do. Because the alcohol industry thrives on the colonial sexism in the Caribbean. And it is destructive, not only for women and families, but for men as well. And I had to stop drinking. But a lot of people don't agree with me, and that's another story. So
we agree with you, Vidya. We agree with you. Thank you so much. I know, like me, probably the rest of you are saying, thank you to Durval and Christine for introducing us to Vidya. Like, how did I not know about Vidya? Thank you. It's a pleasure to listen to you. I'm going to invite Dr. Clark to answer the question I have only for her. I think she's best placed to answer this question of how do we remove barriers to women in leadership? Again, recognizing that gender sensitive leadership, or one of the elements of gender sensitive leadership, is access to leadership for women, having women at the table in the rooms. But again, having heard everyone speak to the barriers, especially in the Caribbean context, for women to access those opportunities, what is the most significant barrier, you would say, and how do we remove that? Big question.
Very big question. The very simple response, which is the most significant barrier to leadership outside of Vidya, is men, right? And you could take it as an acronym, and you are with us now, Vidya, that it's the way we've masculinized the spaces of leadership, the way we've made it so exclusive to who have power and who have connections, and the way we refuse to consult. So there's this non-consultative approach, if that's an expression I can use, MEN. And it speaks to the power structures, inaccessibility of women to spaces of decision making, and not just having a woman as a parliamentarian or a leader, but the one who makes the decisions, her voice is heard. And that's the barrier that we have to fix. Unfortunately, that's linked to all the historical and colonial systems that we exist in the Caribbean, and how we've been socialized. And how do we change a generation and encourage future generations to believe in women? Well, of course, it's education and awareness, but I want to also to identify some tangible approaches. For example, we definitely need to bridge the gap between government and legislators and civil society. That's where women function. That's where we lead. And that's what you said, right, Vidya? It's care, it's advocacy. And if we don't bridge that gap and give women more access to these power structures, then we won't ever break down these barriers. We also need to, if I may, Aisha, I'll take back the 30 seconds from before. And this is because I experience it as a politician, and I feel it for every female politician, the way this masculine space tries to erase our agency for change by sexualizing everything about women and using social media, the space where we do most of our advocacy, to tarnish us. So until we deal with digital justice and gender justice and advocacy, we're never going to break these barriers. But that's why this session is so critical, because this is a digital space. This is a space for women, and this is a space about leadership. So I believe we're on the right track as a Caribbean region. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And isn't it interesting that we would have thought that at some point we overcame many of the barriers, or we fixed some of the issues, but here we are with this new emerging challenge of digital technology, adding this other layer of complexity to this problem of justice and equality between genders. But thank you for that. I am going to invite Ruana to answer this question around the best practices for gender inclusive approaches to leadership. Again, at the level that you operate, you know, the UN, the national policy levels, and how can that machinery of global climate action better promote gender sensitive leadership for resilience in regions like the Caribbean?
Thanks for the question, Aisha. I don't think the system, the way it's set up, the way it's built, the way it's established, is capable of that. At this point, there has been an acknowledgement that this is what is needed. And there is an appreciation of the fact that if we want to have truly sustainable solutions, this is the way that we must go, but there is still a lot of resistance to actually integrating that learning, that knowledge, that worldview, those approaches into what has traditionally been a sanctum of white male power. So I don't think that it's possible for the international system to really foster these things in this way, but I will say, and this is based on my regional work and my work at the national level, that two things are key for this. The first is allyship. And I'm so happy that we have Vidya here as a flag-bearing ally in this context. But the first is allyship. And the second is education. So in that sense, I work with a global climate policy and science institute. And just by the name of it, it sounds as if it comes from that bastion of you know, white male power. But the people that I work with, they understand what needs to be done. And this is part of why we've actually opened an office to serve the Caribbean region, to be able to center those voices and approaches and integrate, I guess, the learnings and the knowledge into the more mainstream climate science approaches. And that allyship is important. My organization, in opening the organization, I agreed to do it on the basis that we would use the brand name of climate analytics to channel funding to places where it would not normally go. So in every single project that we conceive of and that we deliver, we partner with a grassroots or local organization, many of which are led by women, because I see that as a tangible means of using the privilege that I enjoy because of my proximity to these institutions that have a global reputation and are trusted by those with the money to be able to channel that to the places where it's most needed. And a large part of the work that we do is focused on education, on building knowledge and understanding. So in order to make this work sustainable.
Thank you so much. I think what I'm stuck with from your response is the fact that the global machinery won't do it. And so it's again, just emphasizes the importance of the work at this level, at the grassroots level, on the front lines. Mackie, are you by any chance still here? No? Okay. All right, I think Mackie's battery life would have run out. Again, some interesting conversations being had in the chat, some very detailed responses from Ruana to some of those questions. I encourage you to go there. I think at this time, we are at time. Unfortunately, I believe it could go on for a little while longer yet, but I'm going to honor the limit. Well, I think we exceeded it already, but I'm going to say that we will officially bring this conversation to a close. It feels very premature. Feels like there were at least 2 other questions yet to be answered, but maybe that's for part 2 of the panel. Thank you all so much for the very rich insights from Mackie's sharing her Indigenous experiences and you know, the lived realities of her community as it relates to the issues that we discussed, to Vidya and his very engaging and intriguing stories around his work, but more importantly, your reminder to us of the fact that we have an ally in you, and there's some other men somewhere in the Caribbean, maybe we haven't met them yet, who share a similar ideology and support this work in very, very important ways. Dr. Clark, your continued leadership, you've spanned every aspect of this space, educator, activist, politician, and we know that we have an ally in you who is promoting the importance of gender sensitive leadership at the highest level of regional leadership in the Caribbean. Ruana, thank you for sharing your insights, very powerful as they are, very learned as you are in all the details that you're able to give in schooling us on some of these very important learnings around climate governance from the highest level. And Indu, from bringing the experiences from the private sector, speaking about the importance of, doing away with issues like processes like greenwashing, changing the perceptions around business models and how we practice business in the region. All very, very important insights that would have brought us to what I think is a somewhat of a conclusion around the value of gender sensitive leadership, but also the importance of contextualizing that to the different communities and contexts that we operate in. So again, my thanks to you all, and of course, huge thanks to the team at the Breadfruit Collective and the Climate Conscious Podcast for allowing us a space to have these conversations.
Thank you, Aisha, too, for wonderful moderation.
Thank you. Thank you. No, you made it easy.
All right. So, or while I wait for the polls to come down, let me just say thanks again to everyone for joining us for the second day in the Caribbean Women for Climate Justice Conference. Thank you to our panelists. I can't say that enough. And of course, to the team who have been working so hard behind the scenes, or interpreters, or sign language interpreters, or language translators for Spanish and French. Thank you so much. And join us tomorrow, same time, for the discussion on inclusive by design, creating resilient and equitable communities. So yes, that's panel 3, just in case you're wondering, but I'm hoping everyone is taking track. So a very exciting panel that we also have lined up, focusing on the built environment and considerations for that. And of course, operating at the nexus of climate, gender justice, and all the intersectionalities that we need to give consideration to in these conversations. I learned a couple of things today about radical authenticity, digital justice, and data justice from last evening's panel. So of course, this is about the ever increasing intersectionalities, and we're really grateful for this space to dissect these critical issues. It has been a pleasure joining you or sharing in this occasion with you this evening, and I wish you all the best, and please tell a friend to join us tomorrow for more on the Caribbean Women for Climate Justice Conference. I'm Dana Lynn, your host. Thank you and take care.
One way. Qui j'en sais pas, m'pas qu'à comprendre.